Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about something that puzzles many learners of Japanese, especially once they've learned a little Japanese and they start reading Japanese or listening to anime, etc. And this is the fact that Japanese people often make what appear to be negative statements when their meaning is in fact a positive statement. For example, someone may say, Sakura janai, which would appear to mean that isn't Sakura, but its actual meaning is that is Sakura, isn't it? Or even simply that is Sakura. Now, how does this work? How do we recognize it and how do we understand it? For a start, janai is the contraction of de wa nai, which of course is the negative of the copula, as we learned right back in our lesson on Japanese negatives. So, a, b, da, or a, b, desu means A is B. A, B, de wa nai, or de wa arimasen, means A is not B. So there's no question here that we are in fact hearing what is grammatically a negative statement. So how do we interpret this? Well, to begin with, let's remind ourselves of the fact that negative questions are used in most languages, including English, to elicit a positive response. So, if we say it's a nice day, isn't it? We mean that it is a nice day, and we expect our hearer to agree. If we say, are you Sakura? This is a neutral question. We're not suggesting that we either think it is or it isn't. We're simply asking the question. But if we say, aren't you Sakura? Then we are in fact indicating that we think you are Sakura. And a negative question asking for a positive response, like, it's a nice day, isn't it, is common certainly to all the languages I know. In French we have n'est-ce pas, in German we have nicht wahr, and of course in Japanese we have ne, which is originally a negative question. So if we say, Sakura janai desu ka, we're saying exactly the same thing as in English. Isn't that Sakura, meaning we think it is. The first problem that arises here is that while we say in formal speech, Sakura janai desu ka, because in formal speech the ka acts as a verbal question mark, turning any statement into a question, we don't usually use ka as a question-making sentence ender in ordinary, non-formal Japanese. So what would be Sakura janai desu ka in formal Japanese becomes Sakura janai in regular Japanese. Sakura janai has fundamentally three potential meanings. We can say Sakura janai. That means that isn't Sakura. We can say Sakura janai, and that means that's Sakura, isn't it? But we can also say, perhaps meeting Sakura after quite a long time, Sakura janai. And that certainly doesn't mean it isn't Sakura, and it's not a question either. We've actually recognized her, and what we are saying is something that could perhaps best be rendered into English as, if it isn't Sakura, meaning it is Sakura. Now there's nothing particularly mystical and Japanese about this. We do the same sort of thing in English. For example, if we said, she came on Saturday, that's simply conveying a piece of information. If we say, she came on Saturday, we're asking whether she came on Saturday or not. And if we say, she came on Saturday, we've just received the information that she came on Saturday and are expressing surprise about it. We know how to interpret this in English, and it's easy to learn how to interpret janai in Japanese once we understand the range of meaning it possesses. Janai gets used with other meanings too, particularly it gets used as a negative question tag ending, very much like ne. For example, we might say, Hatsui janai, which means pretty much the same thing as Hatsui ne. It's something like a tag question, expecting our listener to agree with us. And we can note here that there's no ambiguity at all in this, because Atsui janai is not the negative of atsui. That's atsukunai. And it can also be put after verbs. For example, mo itta janai, which means, I already said that, didn't I? We should also note that janai is often reduced to just jan in very colloquial speech. And it's often used in that way when it's affirming something or asking for confirmation. Now, it's clear that these expressions are very colloquial, and in fact so colloquial that when we use them with a verb or an adjective, they're not in fact grammatical. And the reason for this, as I've already alluded to, is that, for example, atsui janai is not the negative of atsui because that's atsukunai. Why can't we use janai with verbs or adjectives? Well, that's because, as we learned right back in the first lesson, janai is in fact de wa nai, which is the negative of the copula. So if we say kore wa pen da, we're saying this is a pen. If we say kore wa pen de wa nai, we're saying this is not a pen. And you can't properly use de wa nai with anything but two nouns. I don't actually think that the colloquial statements are fundamentally ungrammatical. It's just that being colloquial, they leave a few steps out of the process. There are, in fact, much more formal ways of using de wa nai as a positive statement, but these, of course, tidy up the grammar. So, for example, if we say, その理論が間違っているのではないでしょうか? We're saying, might that theory not be in error? And we see we have essentially the same construction that we've been dealing with before. その理論が間違っているではない. But that no turns it into a grammatical statement. Why? Because その理論が間違っている means literally that theory exists in a state of mistaking. That's a verbal clause complete in itself. However, when we add no, that no, as we've seen in other lessons, plays the role of a pronoun like thing or one, which is being modified by 間違っている. So now we have that theory exists in a state of error 1. So we have two nouns and we now need a copula to join them together. So, この理論は間違っているのではない means that theory existing in error 1 is not. The でしょうか doesn't add anything grammatically to the statement. As we know, adjectives like nai stand on their own. They don't require a da, even though they get a desu as a mere decoration, a non-grammatical decoration in formal speech. So what deshoka is doing here is it's simply a flag put at the end of the complete grammatical statement. その理論が間違っているのではない. Deshoka turns it explicitly into a question and into a suggestion rather than a statement. So we're saying, might that theory not be a mistaken one? Now, this can mean what it seems to say. It can mean that we're in some doubt and we're actually asking whether that might not be the case. But a lot of the time this is used not just as an assertion, but as a quite strong assertion. We might use this to sum up our argument when we have definitively disproved the theory in question. An American writer or speaker might sum up such an argument with, "It is now clear to anyone with an intelligence greater than that of a Roomba that this theory holds about as much water as a topless thimble in the Sahara Desert. However, that kind of definite assertion in Japanese is not considered either polite or very persuasive. It sounds as if you're trying to make up for a weak argument by a strong assertion. So, the equivalent Japanese speaker may sum up the same completely persuasive argument with, ですから、その理論は間違っているのではないでしょうか? And that means exactly the same thing, allowing for cultural differences. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels, who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.